After the riot in Berkeley, I continued my journeys across the United States. When I was in the southern United States, I got a message that Deborah Lipstadt was going to be holding a meeting at her college in Atlanta, at which security was evidently going to be lax. Normally when Deborah Lipstadt speaks, she takes care to avoid any kind of debate or discussion. I don't know her reasons for that. I would like to suspect that it's not because she's aware of the weakness of the grounds on which she's standing. I was familiar with the fact that she was likely to smear me because she had been hired by the Australian Council of Jews to go all the way across Australia 2 or 3 months earlier. Australia and New Zealand, in fact. They'd hired her, paid her expenses, paid her hotels, paid her luxury airline flights right the way across the world to Australia and right the way across Australia and New Zealand for the express purpose of attacking me and smearing my name everywhere she went. My agents, my friends in Australia and New Zealand sent me clippings reporting on what she had said. She stooped to the most extraordinary tricks to try and blacken my name. She said that I had a life-size portrait of Adolf Hitler hanging in my study. I'm glad to say the Australian newspapers, which are very much on my side in this debate, printed my letter in which I called this allegation weird. In fact, the allegation was first made by Izvestia, the Russian communist newspaper, and although I'm not accusing Professor Lipstadt of basing her opinions on the Russian communist newspapers, since she's never visited me and since she's never even attended one of my lectures, so far as I know, I'm surprised that she purports to know what I've got hanging in my study in London. My friends told me she was going to speak at this meeting in Atlanta, and 2 days' notice I booked airline flights, drove up to an airport, caught a flight to Atlanta, and together with my friends we smuggled our way into the back of the lecture theatre where she was going to address about 500 innocent students at a major university college in Atlanta. We got in so early, in fact, that when I arrived there, we were the only people there, and I carried in a couple of my boxes of Hermann Goering biography, for a reason I'll explain later, and I was astonished that Deborah Lipstadt didn't even recognize me, this person that she'd gone halfway around the world to smear, and here I was standing 5 feet away from her, and yet she didn't show a flicker of astonishment or emotion as I walked past. She was buried deep in girl talk with a couple of the women who had invited her to address the students. And I hung around the back of the building until the other 500 members of the audience filed in. She delivered a speech for about an hour and a half to the students of a looseness and a lack of concentration and a lack of focus, the likes of which I have seldom heard. I would say perhaps 10% of her speech was addressed. You may wonder why we aren't going to show you her actually speaking, why we can't actually use her language, and this is because at the end of the event, which I'm going to describe, she sent university officers over to harass and intimidate the cameraman who had filmed the operation and make a barely veiled threat of legal proceedings if we were to use any of the sound of what had taken place, her humiliation in front of all these students. And on due reflection, we considered it better to give you just the vision of what she said, picture of her speaking, so you can get a picture of this unusual apparition, Professor Lipstadt speaking to the students. But for legal reasons, we think it's better to give you a second-hand description of what she said rather than to use her own words. After all, she doesn't allow us to use our own words in the speeches that she makes. She won't allow any kind of debate. In Australia, the television interviewer actually said at the beginning of the interview with her on one program, which I've got on videotape, "Mrs. Lipstadt, is it true that you refuse to appear in any kind of open, frank debate or discussion with your opponents?" And she had to admit that yes, this was true. She delivered this speech, 10% of which was focused on the actual topic, namely the topic of Holocaust revisionism. And of that 10%, I suppose nearly the entire content was devoted to attacking personally by name the major champions of the revisionist debate, the people who are propagating the campaign for real history in the United States, people like Mark Webber, people like myself, people like Germar Rudolph in Germany. She mentioned us by name, and I was glad she mentioned me by name because that then justified my presence in that auditorium. She attacked us in the usual below-the-belt way. She said the reason why she refused to debate people like us, not knowing in fact that we were actually in the auditorium, was because, hey, you're not going to debate lunatics, are you? You're not going to debate people who say the earth is flat. We maintain that the Holocaust has been grossly exaggerated, by those who are making a lot of money out of it. And that's why they can afford to spend people like Professor Lipstadt around the world, why they can pay her airfares and so on, because the kind of money that costs is chicken feed compared with the billions of dollars that they're raking in. The Anti-Defamation League alone has an annual budget of $37 million a year in the United States alone for the express purpose of smearing people like me and you for listening to this video. Professor Lipstadt then made a fatal mistake. In this speech, she said two things, which in fact are flatly contradictory of each other. The first thing she said was, we are deeply worried because gradually the survivors, the eyewitnesses of the Holocaust, are dying out. And when they die out, the legend or the story or the truth about the Holocaust, as she said it, may die out with them, because then there will be nobody else who will carry the story forward and give it flesh and blood. But at the same time, she said, and anyway, there are millions of documents, there are mountains of documents. Those are the words she used. There are mountains of documents that prove that the Holocaust happened. There are documents that she herself has seen, that she herself has, including, and I quote verbatim, Professor Lipstadt saying, including a document that she has, namely the blueprint of the gas chambers at Auschwitz, including the holes in the ceiling through which the SS officers tipped the cyanide pellets. A fatal mistake, for two reasons. The first reason being, of course, is, hey, if you've got these mountains of documents, why do you worry about the eyewitnesses and survivors dying out and the legend dying with them? But of course, the truth is that the only evidence for the legend is what the eyewitnesses, the so-called eyewitnesses, state, what I would call the oral reports of these people, their memories, their retrieved memories, to use a modern fashionable slogan in psychiatry, their retrieved memories. If you've got the documents, if you've got the blueprints, then who needs the eyewitnesses? Professor Lipstadt. Well, I kept in my place. I bit my lip and I shut up. I shut up even when she criticized some of my closest friends. I shut up when she poured scorn and contempt on us. I shut up when the audience erupted in laughter at some of her cruder witticisms. I shut up when she again and again dragged up the reference to sexual abuse of children as being a good thing, the closest she could get to the argument against the Holocaust revisionists. I shut up until the end, when she then sat down amidst general applause from these students who had occasionally yawned and looked round boredly and looked at their watches, because they must have wondered what they were doing in there that morning. What's it got to do with education? Why are they sitting there in a college in Atlanta when they should be learning useful things like computer technology or engineering design or foreign languages? And instead they've been dragged in by some phony course which has been spiked on them by some Jewish-orientated body in the United States, which makes it now compulsory to learn about the Holocaust. Then came question time. Deborah Lipstadt stood on the platform and invited questions without knowing that the very people that she had been smearing were sitting in the back rows of the audience. Sam Dixon was the first to ask a question. She invited him to speak. Sam Dixon said, Professor Lipstadt, you have mentioned the name of David Irving several times in disparaging terms. Are you not aware that he is one of the world's most widely read historians? That his books are read more widely than the works of any other historian around the world? That he's been translated into more languages than any other historians around the world? And yet you have done nothing but pour contempt and scorn on his name. Can you tell us some more about that? Said Sam Dixon, the lawyer, using very neutral language. Professor Lipstadt must have been slightly nervous at the fact that this wasn't a flattering, fawning question that she had expected. And when Sam Dixon asked a follow-up question, she rudely snapped at him, sit down, I don't want any more of this. When Sam Dixon sat down, without his question having been properly answered, I then raised my hand in the proper approved manner, and Lipstadt invited me to speak. And I said, Professor Lipstadt, are you aware of the fact that my books, I am in fact the David Irving to which you have made disparaging references throughout your speech of the last hour and a half? And I'm sure you were not aware that I was. And of course, as I spoke with my English accent in this Atlanta audience, a thrill went through the whole audience. Everyone turned round to see what the hell was going on. When I said that I was the David Irving that she'd been smearing, the students knew that this was going to be something the likes of which they were not expecting. A black sitting next to Martin O'Toole said, man, this is going to be fun now, this is going to be fun. Deborah Lipstadt had to let me speak because she had been smearing me, and she knew that the students like fair play. I said, you have just told the students a lie. You have told the students that you have a blueprint of the gas chambers at Auschwitz which actually show the holes in the roof through which the SS officers poured the cyanide to kill millions of people. I want you to admit this is a lie, because you know it's a lie. And if you won't admit it's a lie, then let me do the following. And I reached into my inner pocket and I pulled out a wad of $1,000 in $20 bills, and I held it aloft. And I said, I've got $1,000 here for you, Mrs. Lipstadt, $1,000 for you, Professor, which you can have if you can now produce that document which you just told the student exists. And if you can't produce it now, then if you can at least tell the students where they can find it. And if you can't tell the students where they can find it, then you will admit that you've told them a lie. And this is what it's all about, Professor Lipstadt, because you have been lying, and the likes of you have been lying, and you've been going around the world, peddling these lies around the world. And if you don't want to tell the students here who paid your fares, and who paid your airline tickets, and who paid your fees all around Australia and New Zealand, this journey that you're so proud of having made, I'll tell the students who paid it. And she became very indignant, and I could see people running around, and university officials talking to university officials, and I knew I only had a couple more minutes to talk probably before I was bodily thrown out. But I continued to hold those $1,000 bills aloft because this is the kind of language the students understand. Students are generally hard-pressed for cash. And here's somebody at the back of them offering the woman who's been speaking to them for an hour and a half $1,000 which she can come down off the podium and take out of his hand if she can produce the document that she has sworn to them exists, and yet she can't. And all she can do is to rampage on and say, well, ladies and gentlemen, all I can say is that we couldn't have asked for any scene and episode better than this. Mr. Irving is somebody who couldn't have been better picked by central casting. He is your typical fascist that central casting would have picked. But the students weren't buying this, because I was still standing and I now had in my hand a copy of my Hermann Goering biography. And I called out to the students and I said, if you want to believe which of us is telling the truth, Professor Lipstadt says I have no credibility and that no respected historian around the world gives me any reputation or respects my opinions. That's what she says. That's what she told you during her talk. And yet here I have a copy of my Hermann Goering biography, not just one, but I brought 100 copies with me. And on the back of that you will find the opinions of the most respected historians in the world, in which they say that I'm one of the greatest writers and one of the finest biographers. So who do you believe, her or me? And if you want this book, I said to the students, I've got 100 copies and they're yours for free, because it's important that I protect my reputation from smearmongers like Professor Deborah Lipstadt and the people who are paying her to go around the world doing this to me. At this point, Mrs. Lipstadt decided that she was losing ground, and fearing even worse humiliation, she gave a signal for security to be sent to have me evicted. An armed, uniformed security officer came into the back of the hall where I was standing and told me that if I didn't sit down and be quiet, he would have me evicted, and was I prepared to be quiet? I thought, I told the students this. I called out to them. I said, this is the answer that Professor Lipstadt has to our perfectly reasonable questions. I've asked her to produce the document that she says exists. Her answer is to have security called to throw me out. Well, I sat there quietly at the back of the hall for the rest of the meeting, which lasted another 10 minutes, occasionally waving my $1,000 bills in the air every time she said the documents existed. I just waved the $1,000 in the air and quietly called out, $1,000, Professor, $1,000 for you. And the students began roaring of laughter because they knew who was speaking the truth. Now, as the students had walked past, one or two of them during the meeting, I'd handed out copies of my Hermann Goering book to them because I wanted to seed the audience. Because the worst thing that would happen is if those students walked past with their noses in the air and refused to accept the book from me. But believe me, as they filed out at the end of the meeting, they stood in line for 10 or 15 minutes to pick up copies of that book from me. I sat at the back, I broke open packages of the books, I handed them out to them. And as I handed them out to them, the students started coming back and saying, could they possibly have signatures and autographs from me? And this was the worst possible humiliation for Professor Lipstadt. She had said that I was a historian with no reputation, a man who was a central casting fascist, as she had said. And yet this was her audience lining up into their own break time, waiting for me to sign a book for them. And outside the auditorium, I sat later for 15, 20, 30 minutes talking to the students, showing them the aerial photographs of Auschwitz, which I'd showed in the auditorium to Professor Lipstadt. I said, how could you explain these aerial photographs? And here are the photographs. I showed them to the students. I showed the lack of any photographs of any smoke coming from the so-called crematoria, lack of any evidence of the existence of the gas chambers, lack of any evidence of the existence of the mountains of coke that would have been needed to cremate the tens of thousands of bodies that are talked about nowadays by the Holocaust historians. Look, this was the aerial, visual, photographic evidence which the Holocaust historians have failed to address. And I showed this to the students, and I can only say they were interested. They lapped it up. They pored over the photographs. They kept on lining up, kept on coming back, pleading for more copies of my books, pleading for my signatures. Then they brought copies of the posters advertising that day's meeting with Professor Lipstadt's name on it. And would I autograph that poster for them too? 2 or 3 students brought that. And believe me, the thrill I got when I saw that that was an unsigned poster. She hadn't signed it yet, so she was going to have to sign after me. They got my signature first, and they were going to have to get her signature after mine. She can't have enjoyed it at all. When she then went a few days later to go and speak in California at Chico State College, I tried to get her an invitation, tried to get the tickets to get in there too, but we learned for some unknown reason security was being tightened on that meeting, and the tickets were totally unavailable to outsiders. So this is the truth about the Holocaust historians, the so-called historians. And of course, Professor Lipstadt had to admit to me my very first question to her. I said, Professor Lipstadt, you're not a professor of history, are you? You're a professor of religion. You're not a historian at all. And she tried to waffle around it and tried to flannel around it with her expertise in this and her knowledge of that. But that's the truth. She's not a historian and I am. So whom do you believe? Whom do the students believe now? Who got the humiliation? Professor Lipstadt. And it's thanks to the people around the world who have contributed to my fighting fund to make it possible for me to go and spring surprises on our enemies like that. They're not going to like me any more for it, and I'm sure I'm a marked man from now on. But I'm not going to be intimidated. I'm not going to be evicted. I'm not going to be silenced. I'm not going to be squashed. I'm not going to be squelched the way that I squelched Professor Deborah Lipstadt at that meeting in her college in Atlanta only a few weeks ago.